Hello, and thanks for joining us for Into the Killing. If you know of a cold case that was eventually solved and you want us to cover it on Into the Killing, please visit our website, criminallylisted.com, then go to the Suggest a Case page. You can also suggest cases for our two YouTube channels, Criminally Listed and Paranormally Listed. In this episode, we're going back to April 1977. On April 11th, 1977, the Los Angeles Supreme Court Commissioner made a ruling on an unusual case. A month earlier, Beverly Hills socialite and oil heiress Sandra West had died at age 37. There are several different reports about the cause of her death. Some reports say she died from injuries sustained in a car crash, others say she died of a drug overdose, and finally, some say she died after overdosing on drugs she was taking because of injuries she suffered in the car crash. Sandra's husband, Ike West Jr., had died under mysterious circumstances in a motel room in Las Vegas, Nevada, 9 years earlier. Ike, who was 33, abused drugs and was on a crash diet when he died. Ike's family was based in Texas, and they first made their fortune with cattle. Then they became even richer when they invested in oil. In 1963, Ike and Sandra relocated to Los Angeles, California. After Ike died, Sandra inherited over $5 million, which, accounting for inflation, is $51 million in 2024. Sandra had an unusual clause in her will. She would leave her brother $3 million if he buried her in a very specific way. She wanted to be dressed in her favorite white lace nightgown, which wasn't too odd. What was strange was that she wanted to be buried in her beloved 1964 Ferrari 300 America. She wanted to be placed in the front seat with, quote, the seat slanted comfortably, unquote. On April 11, 1977, the commissioner ruled that her request was unusual, but nothing she requested was illegal. Sandra's body was held in the Los Angeles mausoleum until mid-May, then her body and her car were shipped to San Antonio, Texas. At the Alamo Masonic Cemetery, the car with Sandra West's body was placed in a large crate. The crate was then lowered into the grave with a crane. Then the crate was filled with cement to deter vandals and grave robbers. Finally, it was covered with dirt. Sandra West's gravesite is a notable attraction in the cemetery. On April 23, 1977, two famous Johns were born. Comedian and late-night talk show host John Oliver was born in Birmingham, England. Professional wrestler and actor John Cena was born in West Newbury, Massachusetts. The two men have joked about being born on the same day, in the same year, and having the same name, but turning out to be two very different people, especially in terms of their physiques. John Oliver has said, quote, I think of John Cena on every birthday now. Specifically, I'm not just one step closer to death, I am 20 steps closer to death than he is, unquote. In 2021, in an interview with Stephen Colbert, Cena said, quote, do you know what it's like living in someone's shadow? John Oliver said he thinks of me every birthday now. I have thought about John Oliver for 44 years. I think this is a psychological warfare tactic by my parents. I try so hard to get my own identity, and just around April 20th, I feel pretty good about myself, and then on April 23rd, I am reminded that I'm never, ever possibly going to do anything better than the existence of John Oliver, unquote. At the time of this recording, John Oliver has a contract to host Last Week Tonight with John Oliver for 3 more seasons. According to John Cena's IMDb page, he has 6 upcoming projects, including the 2nd season of Peacemaker. On April 21, 1977, the musical Annie made its Broadway debut at the Elvin Theater, which was later renamed the Neil Simon Theater. Annie had made its world debut less than a year earlier as a pre-Broadway tryout at the Goodspeed Opera House in East Haddam, Connecticut. Annie was a massive hit on Broadway. The musical is based on Harold Gray's Little Orphan Annie comic strip. It follows the adventures of the titular Annie, a spunky young orphan with red hair who is taken in by wealthy businessman Oliver Warbucks. The original production was nominated for 11 Tony Awards, and it took home 7, including Best Musical. The original production ran for 6 years. It was the longest-running show at the Elvin Theater. It held that record until 2019, when Hairspray took that title. Annie has been adapted into a major motion picture twice, once in 1982 and again in 2014. It's been revived over a dozen times and is also popular in regional and high school productions. The New York Times estimated that it's performed 700 to 900 times yearly in the United States. On April 14, 1977, David Soul's Don't Give Up on Us was the number one song. Soul rose to fame playing Detective Kenneth Hutch Hutchinson in the ABC series Starsky and Hutch. The number one movie on April 14, 1977 was Rocky. Port Alberni is a small city on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada. It's a picturesque city that is nearly surrounded by mountains. First Nations people have lived in the area for thousands of years. Petroglyph carvings have been found in the area. Europeans first came to the area in 1856. In April 1977, it had a population of about 19,500 people. It was home to 12-year-old Carolyn Lee. Carolyn was a good child who was responsible and very bright. She was shy and quiet, and it wasn't unusual to see her nose in a book. For 4 years, Carolyn had been taking tap dance classes at a local dance school. In April 1977, the students were preparing for their end-of-the-year show. Normally, after dance class at 6:30 p.m., Carolyn would walk 3 blocks to her family's restaurant and have a glass of milk. Then her father would pick her up around 6:45. Then they would pick up her sister, Brenda, who was a year older, at gymnastics. On April 14th, several people saw Carolyn leave the dance school at 6:35. She was walking towards her family's restaurant. The brother of one of her classmates offered her a ride, and she said no. When her father arrived at the restaurant at 6:45, Carolyn wasn't there. Her father drove to the dance school, but it was closed and no one was there. He picked up Brenda and they went home. Carolyn's family continued to search for her. At 8 p.m., they called the police. Within 5 minutes, searches for the little girl were started, including door-to-door searches. But Carolyn wasn't found that night. The next day on radio news programs, the police asked people who had rural properties to check their properties. Around 5 p.m., a man who owned a potato farm looked around and found tire tracks in the mud near the road his farm was situated on. He followed the tire tracks and found the partially dressed body of 12-year-old Carolyn Lee. The man was careful not to disturb the crime scene. When he found the body, he was closer to his neighbor's home than his own, so he went there and had them call the police. Carolyn had been sexually assaulted and died of blunt force trauma to the head. The pathologist believes she had been lying face down in the mud when she was struck at least twice in the back of the head, most likely with a rock. Her clothes were found scattered nearby. Carolyn's family and the police surmised that she was taken by force. Carolyn was responsible and would have never gotten into a stranger's vehicle. Also, someone she knew had offered her a ride at the dance hall and she turned them down. The murder shocked the small city. Over 300 people attended her funeral. The police conducted a massive investigation and tried to preserve as much evidence as possible. But they were missing some important evidence, like the murder weapon. Divers even searched a nearby lake, but they did not find anything of interest. The first suspect was the man who found the body, but they couldn't connect him to the murder in any other way. The police talked to tire sellers in the area. According to Shane Morrow's book, The Bulldog and the Helix, the 2 tire shop owners believe the tracks were made by 700 by 15 Sieberling commuter lug tires. The tires are commonly found on 4-wheel drive vehicles. The police then divided the city into 4 zones and searched for 4-wheel drive vehicles with those type of tires. But their searches were fruitless. 10 days after the body was found, a woman contacted the police. She said that months before the murder, a man took her to the same area where the body was found and sexually assaulted her. She said she would recognize the man's vehicle if she saw it again. So an officer drove her around a neighborhood and she saw a 1977 Chevrolet Blazer. She identified it as the vehicle her attacker drove. The officer noted that the Blazer had 700 by 15 Sieberling commuter lug tires. The vehicle belonged to 27-year-old Gurmeet Singh Dillon. He worked at a foundry owned by his family less than a quarter mile from the dance school. He lived less than a mile south of the foundry. 2 miles southeast of his home is where Carolyn's body was found. The woman was shown a photo lineup that included Dillon's photo. The police had Dillon's photo because he had been arrested before. However, the woman did not pick him out of the photo lineup. Even when the officer singled out his photo and asked if he was the man who assaulted her, she said he wasn't her attacker. The police interviewed Dillon. He said on the evening of the murder, he left the foundry between 6:30 and 7. He went to a car wash a few hundred feet from the foundry and had his car washed. Afterward, he went to a local hotel bar where he drank until 8:30. He walked out of the bar and his common-law wife was waiting outside for him. She was angry because he was supposed to come home for dinner hours earlier. He said that he then drove home. He also said he knew about the logging road where the body was dumped because he used to go drinking there when he was young. Dillon cooperated with the investigators. He gave his fingerprints and allowed his Blazer to be searched. Dillon even gave up his vacuum cleaner to be searched. But none of the evidence seemed to connect Dillon to Carolyn's murder. Hairs were found on Carolyn's clothing. An expert said the hairs were light and most likely from a white person. A pubic hair was found in Carolyn's sweater. A forensic expert compared Carolyn and Dillon's pubic hair to the hair. It did not match either of them. The police had collected Dillon's vacuum because they thought if he had cleaned his Blazer after the murder, there might be evidence in the vacuum bag. But nothing of interest was found. Dillon was asked to take a polygraph exam and he agreed. The results were inconclusive. The police had nothing to connect Dillon to Carolyn's murder, so they continued to look at other suspects like sex offenders. But no arrests were made. The case ultimately went cold. In the ensuing years, Gurmeet Singh Dillon had few brushes with the law. In 1979, he was arrested for making harassing phone calls. He was fined $150. In November 1983, 6 years after Carolyn's murder, Dillon's now estranged wife was interviewed by the police. Dillon had been living with her at the time of the murder, but they weren't married. She had married him in the years after Carolyn's murder, but by 1983, they were separated. Dillon told the police he left the foundry between 6:30 and 7. Carolyn had been kidnapped between 6:35 and 6:45 p.m. Dillon's estranged wife explained she had made dinner at 6 p.m. that night and Dillon wasn't home by 6:30. She left their home at 6:30 and drove to the foundry, which took about 3 minutes. When she got there, the foundry was closed for the day. She checked several bars and did not find him. After being out of the house for 15 minutes, she returned home. She called several bars looking for her husband, but still didn't find him. This was promising to the police because it differed from Dillon's version of events. Why would Dillon lie about what he did that night? Carolyn was kidnapped after leaving the dance school at 6:35, and the dance school was a few hundred feet from the foundry. Dillon's wife went directly to the foundry from their home, so she was at the foundry around 6:35 and it was closed. This means that Dillon did not have an alibi for the time of the kidnapping, and he was in the area where Carolyn was taken. After Dylan's estranged wife talked to the police, he took another polygraph exam. Once again, the results were inconclusive. The police still did not have any evidence to charge Dylan with anything. However, he remained on the police's radar. Then in July 1984, Gurmeet Singh Dhillon was arrested. He was accused of sexually assaulting a 54-year-old woman in February 1984 and a 36-year-old woman in June 1984. However, both charges were dismissed. In 1989, the lead investigator on Carolyn's case was at the dentist. In the waiting room, he was looking through a copy of Equinox magazine and came across an article about the murders of Linda Mann and Don Ashworth, which was the first case solved by DNA. We covered that case in our first podcast episode. The detective reached out to a Canadian DNA expert who was quoted in the article. The expert told the detective that a DNA profile could be created from a decade-old cold case as long as the biological sample had been stored properly. So the detective repeatedly requested to have the DNA profile made. But at the time, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police did not have the technology to create the profile. Another piece of evidence the detective wanted examined was Carolyn's jacket. A boot print was found on the back of the jacket. The detective wanted the footprint to be tested for metals. Dylan worked in a foundry, so metals might have attached to the treads of his boots. If they could find metals that were specifically found in the foundry in the boot print, it could be a strong piece of evidence. But that testing was not performed either. In early 1992, Dylan was again in jail after being arrested for sexual assault. The woman said that Dylan told her he would kill her, just like he had killed Carolyn Lee. The police asked Dylan for a blood sample twice, and he said he would have to talk to his lawyer. He did not give them a sample while he was in jail. He was released from jail after the charges were dismissed once again. At the time, there were no laws allowing the police to obtain a warrant to take a blood sample from someone. But they could get a warrant to collect things that had DNA on it, like cigarette butts or beer bottles. So they got a warrant to search his trailer and collect items that might have his DNA. When the detectives arrived at his trailer, they told Dylan they had a warrant. He immediately consented to give a sample of his blood, and they went to the hospital. So the warrant was not served and his trailer was not searched. At this point, the RCMP was able to make DNA profiles. Dylan's DNA was compared to DNA found on the vaginal swabs twice over the years, but the findings weren't strong enough to make an arrest. However, neither test eliminated Dylan as a suspect. Then, in July 1994, a woman contacted the police. She said that for the past 17 years, she had been haunted by what she saw on the day Carolyn was murdered, but she had been too afraid to say anything. She said around the time Carolyn was kidnapped, she had been driving near the intersection closest to where the body was found. She said she saw an Indo-Canadian man driving an SUV. There was a little Asian girl in the vehicle, and it looked like she was screaming for help. Then a blonde white man pulled the girl down. She specifically remembered the blonde man because he looked freaked out when he saw her. She believed it was because she was driving a decommissioned police car. She said that when the man realized she wasn't a police officer, he looked relieved. But there was a problem with the woman's statement. It had been 17 years since Carolyn's murder. Port Alberni is a small city, and it was common knowledge among the residents that Gurmeet Singh Dhillon was the police's prime suspect. However, the police believed she was telling the truth. In July 1995, it became law in Canada that the police could get a DNA warrant. This means they could legally get a blood or saliva sample from a suspect. So they decided to get a DNA warrant to get a second sample from Dylan. They thought there might be a problem with the volunteer DNA sample they collected years earlier. For example, Dylan's lawyer could say he was legally forced to give the sample, then the DNA evidence could be thrown out. They used the woman's statement and other circumstantial evidence to get the warrant. In March 1996, the warrant was issued and they collected a blood sample from Dylan. At this point, DNA technology had improved, but it still wasn't definitive enough to charge Dylan with murder. But once again, testing did not eliminate Dylan. Then, another preteen girl was murdered in Port Alberni. On July 31st, 1996, 19 years after Carolyn's murder, 11-year-old Jessica States attended a softball tournament at a park near her home. She was last seen at about 9:45 p.m. standing under a tree in the park. There were massive searches for her. About 16 hours later, her body was found in a creek a few hundred feet from where she was last seen. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. It was suspected that a liquor bottle that was found at the scene had been used. Many people saw parallels between Carolyn and Jessica's murders. Both were preteen girls who were kidnapped from public spaces in the evening. They were both sexually assaulted and beaten to death, and their bodies were found in isolated areas. One thing the police and the media noted was that Dylan lived a block from the crime scene. A problem for the police was that the softball tournament brought a lot of people from other areas to Port Alberni, specifically the park where Jessica was kidnapped. Many people from out of town were staying at a campground that was close to both the park and the creek where the body was found. So there were many more possible persons of interest. At this point, because of their work on Carolyn's murder, the police understood how important DNA evidence was. So they were extra careful when collecting biological samples. They found a piece of chewing gum under Jessica's body. The vaginal swabs and gum were tested for DNA. They were a bit surprised the gum had two sets of DNA on it, Jessica's and her attacker's. There are a few theories about how both sets of DNA ended up on the gum. One was that the attacker took the gum from her mouth, chewed it, and then spit it out. He could have done this to show he was the one in power. Or he got his DNA on it while he was kissing her. There were also marks on her body, which were from the killer sucking on her. He may have been chewing gum and then sucked on her, and that's how her DNA ended up on the gum. Also, the gum was found under her body, so it's possible that her skin touching the gum led to the DNA transfer. The police started canvassing for DNA. Many people playing in the baseball tournament were the first to give a sample of their DNA, but none of them were a match. The police eventually collected over 700 DNA samples. However, they could only test 24 at a time. It was not long before Jessica's case went cold. Then in March 1997, 20 years after Carolyn Lee's murder, Gurmeet Singh Dhillon was arrested for her murder. The media asked the police if they had connected Dhillon to Jessica States' murder. They said they had investigated him, but he was not a suspect. A few months later, several pieces of evidence from Carolyn's murder were examined by electron microscopy specialists. One of the pieces of evidence was Carolyn's jacket. In the boot print, 19 particles were found that could have come from the foundry floor. Something else that was examined was Dylan's vacuum bag. The scientists found 51 particles that were very similar to the particles in the boot print, but they were not identical. Gurmeet Singh Dhillon went to trial in November 1998. A lot had changed in those 21 years. The three biggest movies at the worldwide box office in 1977 were Star Wars Episode IV, A New Hope, Smokey and the Bandit, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. In 1998, Armageddon, Saving Private Ryan, and Godzilla were the three biggest movies. The three biggest songs of 1977 were Tonight's the Night, Gonna Be Alright, by Rod Stewart, I Just Want to Be Your Everything by Andy Gibb, and The Best of My Love by The Emotions. In 1998, it was Too Close by Next, The Boy Is Mine by Brandy and Monica, and You're Still the One by Shania Twain. Popular books published in 1977 were Stephen King's The Shining, Catherine Patterson's Bridge to Terabithia, and Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror. A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin, Paulo Coelho's Veronica Decides to Die, and Nick Hornby's About a Boy were all published in 1998. The most watched shows in 1977 were Laverne and Shirley, Happy Days, and Three's Company. In 1998, ER, Friends, and Frasier were the most watched TV shows. Interestingly, the police did not have the DNA tested before he was arrested. Instead, they waited until days before the trial before they compared the DNA for a fourth time. By that time, DNA testing had improved greatly. The odds that the DNA was Dylan's was determined to be 1 in 165 million. 99.9999994% of people did not have a DNA profile. The DNA match was the main evidence against Dylan. At the trial, Dylan's ex-wife testified. She had more details that she had not shared when she was interviewed for the first time in 1983. She said on the night of the murder, around 7 p.m., she was standing at her kitchen window and she had a good view of an intersection behind their home. She saw Dylan driving south towards their home. He should have turned right to head to their home. Instead, he continued to drive south towards the area where Carolyn's body was found. She assumed he had been going to buy cigarettes at a store about a block from their home. But he didn't return home until 7:30. When he came home, he was not in a good mood. His blazer was muddy, especially the wheel wells. There were sticks and brush in the wheel wells. It looked as if he had been off-roading. He told her to wash the car by hand, and she did so. Also, that night, without explanation, he cut the cover off the steering wheel. Dylan's lawyer argued that Dylan's ex-wife had made up the story because she was bitter and angry at him. She denied that was the case and said she was telling the truth. Dylan's lawyer argued that the police developed tunnel vision for Dylan. As proof of this, he talked about the photo lineup when the woman didn't identify Dylan in it, and then the officer singled out his photo to show her. The lawyer also pointed out that blonde hair was found on the clothing, and Dylan did not have blonde hair. Dylan's lawyer also argued that the DNA evidence was not reliable. In 1997, DNA evidence was still considered a new science. 2 years earlier, O.J. Simpson was famously found not guilty of murdering his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ron Goldman. There were 108 pieces of DNA evidence, including Simpson's blood being found at the crime scene, and the victim's blood being found in Simpson's vehicle and at his home. Dylan's defense utilized a unique strategy. They hired a forensic engineer to reconstruct the timeline with a mannequin filling in for Carolyn. The engineer had Dylan work the same shift he had worked the day of the murder. At the end of the day, Dylan was dirty. He washed his hands, and then he and the engineer left the foundry. They went to the area where the body was found. The engineer had Dylan undress the mannequin. When he did, the clothes got dirty and had dust on them. The defense pointed out that there were no marks or dirt on Carolyn's clothes. If Dylan kidnapped, raped, and murdered Carolyn, some dirt and dust from the foundry should have left stains on her clothes. But the prosecution had two explanations for this. Perhaps Carolyn undressed herself. Another possibility is that Dylan worked with a partner. A long-held theory by the police was that two people were involved in the crime, Dylan and a white man with blonde hair. The police thought that the kidnapping would have been easier if there were two people, the driver and the person who grabbed Carolyn. Secondly, the witness said that she saw two men in the blazer. One was an Indo-Canadian man, and the second was a white, blonde man. Third, blonde hairs were found on Carolyn's clothes. There was a pubic hair, which was not a match to Dylan or Carolyn's. Finally, traces of another person's DNA were found on vaginal swabs. The trial lasted a month. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found 48-year-old Gurmeet Singh Dhillon guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without the chance of parole for 25 years. He was eligible for parole in 2023. If he was paroled, the media did not report on his release. The police have not said if they have continued to investigate Carolyn's murder to see if Dylan had a partner. What is known is that no one else has been arrested for her murder. 8 months after Dylan was convicted, in June 1999, the police made an arrest in the murder of Jessica States. 2 years earlier, the police had asked for DNA samples from a group of young men who were considered troublemakers in Port Alberni. One of them was 17-year-old Roderick Padden. Several times he was asked for a DNA sample, and he had said no. He finally voluntarily gave one. The police had a major backlog of DNA samples because they had collected DNA samples from over 700 people. So it was 2 years before Padden's DNA was compared to the killer's DNA. In August 1999, Padden was interviewed by the police and he confessed to Jessica's murder. He came across her at the park and decided to rape her. He was strong and a known fighter. He said he punched her once in the head and knocked her out. The medical examiner believed that this blow caused brain damage. So Jessica was probably unconscious during her assault and murder. Padden did not talk about what else he did to her, but he did admit to punching and raping her, which was enough for the police. Padden went to trial in June 2001. The main evidence against him was the DNA and his confession. It only took the jury 3 hours to find 23-year-old Roderick Padden guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life with a chance of parole after 25 years. He will first be eligible for parole in 2026. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. If you want to learn more about the murder of Carolyn Lee and Jessica States, please check out Shane Morrow's book, The Bulldog and the Helix. It was an incredible resource for writing this episode. Also, like we said in the beginning, if you have any cases to suggest for Into the Killing, Criminally Listed, or Paranormally Listed, please visit our website, criminallylisted.com. But that's all for this week. Thank you again for listening. Please take care of yourself and stay safe.